Hey, good evening, everybody. Just sitting out here in some nature, listening to the frogs and bugs sing their songs, and wanted to take a minute and share with you some of what I've been pondering over the last probably 24 hours since I last did my current Bible study. Reading in the Gospels about, I'm up to the point where I'm reading about what happened after Jesus was crucified. And it's kind of a shorter set of scripture in this certain lesson, and talked about, ironically, why the tomb of Jesus was sealed and guarded. And it's funny, I had to acknowledge the fact that it's really apparent to me that I grew up in the church, because that was normal. I didn't question it. I guess it just made sense in the back of my mind, and I never asked any questions because that's the way the story was always told. And realizing that if I hadn't grown up in the church and that's not the story that I had always heard, what would I have thought? And my immediate question would be, why in the world do they have guards blocking the tomb of somebody they hated? A dead guy buried behind in a cave, basically, behind a big boulder that they had no respect for. And like, even as I'm saying the words, I step back and I think, like, man, just think about how weird and strange that has to sound. That horrible murder, or a horrible, brutal crucifixion of a guy who had gained some celebrity that the Jews were getting nervous about from a theological, even political standpoint. He's crucified in an ugly, mocking, brutal way. Has no status, no, other than a small group of followers. He's lost all the celebrity and everything. And yet they guard the tomb. So, to get to my point, Scripture says that it was the Pharisees who had set up this deal. They go to Pilate, and what they are concerned about is that they are paranoid. They have this big conspiracy theory, essentially, that hasn't even played out yet, that Jesus was a big fraud, and his followers were a bunch of people who had drank the Kool-Aid, for lack of better words, and they were worried that Jesus had predicted that he would rise from the dead in 3 days. They knew that very specific fact. And their concern was, from again, kind of a theological, political standpoint, that if the body were to be stolen by his followers, then the lie could continue. In fact, it would grow, and Jesus would become the figurehead of this blaspheming false religion. And so Pilate, kind of just entertaining the locals at this point, right, says, whatever, you've got the power to prevent that. Go and do whatever you want to do. And so that's exactly what they do. They set up guard right outside of this tomb, and not only that, but the big rock that was rolled in front of the entrance to the tomb was sealed shut. And I've seen numerous different depictions, wax seals, ropes, different things. Something that would have had to have been broken, and you would it would be very painfully obvious that somebody had broken into the tomb if it had been tampered with, is the idea. So that's what they do. They set it all up, right? And it's just so interesting to me on some level, because when I really step back and think about it, it kind of speaks both to the miracle, obviously, of what happened, just Jesus rising from the dead himself and everything, but the lengths at which the Jews, Jesus' own people, the lengths at which they were willing to go to ignore their own history, ignore their own prophecy, ignore all of the miracles, and then just to ignore Jesus himself. The fact that he's so lined up with their own prophetic teachings of a coming Messiah, and yet to maintain the status quo of their current theocracy, they were willing to say and do whatever it took to discredit Jesus. And so you've got this whole conspiracy thing happening, this whole paranoid deal where they've just killed the guy very publicly, very brutally. And medically speaking, it was understood without fail that Jesus did in fact die. Even though he was humiliated and was in no way honored, he got a rich person's burial. And the same people who went to such incredible lengths to kill this man that they were afraid of. And that's what it is at the end of the day. They were so afraid of Jesus undoing their status quo that they killed him. And it continued, this fear that should have gone away the moment he was gone. They so feared his popularity, and they justified it under this idea that they feared that the lie would continue and be worse the second time around if his followers in fact pulled off this scheme that had never been spoken of by anybody, but that they dreamed up in their own heads. They were dead convinced that that Jesus' followers would go to these lengths to make his prophecy come true. Now, as we know, and I'll probably talk about later because I've been talking about all my studies recently, obviously the guard is set up. The tomb is sealed. Nothing has been tampered with until the big moment, when the ground shakes and the guards are dealing with sights of angels, and you know the whole story, right? And everything is undone. But I just really had to step back and think about how much Jesus' own people were going, what they were willing to do to feed their own denial. In fact, in many ways, it's the same issue that the Jewish people, from a Christian perspective, are still struggling with today. That there's all of this evidence, there's all of this historical context, there's all of this stuff that makes our faith and our religion what we cling to. And that is the very same evidence and stories and even conspiracy theory that exists today that keeps Jewish believers from accepting the Messiah that we believe came. So it's interesting, right? Still trying to denounce that he, in some ways, didn't exist at all, trying to denounce his divinity, trying to paint him off as some noble teacher or just all around good guy, which is crazy because Jesus didn't give us that option. He was performing miracles, he was upsetting systems, he was not being revered as like a cool guy, he was very much a rebel. And at one point, just outright claimed to be God, which he was. But by today's standards would mean that he's not some brilliant wise man. He was either in fact God or in fact crazy. But you can't just land in the middle with statements like that. And so was just really intrigued by stepping back and thinking, from an outsider's perspective, from a non-born in the church, raised in the church perspective, what in the world would possess the Jews, the Pharisees, to guard and seal the tomb in the first place? When you really think about it, it makes no sense whatsoever. And at the same time, there's like a brilliance in God's plan that even happened, because the very thing that the Jews of the day, the Pharisees of the day, were worried about happening, which was that Jesus's followers would pull off this hoax. In reality, in today's terms, the suggested hoax by non-believers is that the whole event was orchestrated, that Jesus's body disappearing was orchestrated. When in reality, the Romans and the Jews working together to protect the tomb also, in fact, guarded against such claims of a hoax. Guarded against, really it guarded the integrity of the story and the integrity of the tomb. So I just found it very fascinating to see how it all played out, to see how God interwove things and orchestrated things, and just the struggles, I guess, of a people to ignore their own answer, their own, in a way, promise from God. The Jews were God's chosen people. And after millennia, they were still choosing to take something less than God's best. And were willing to do anything to stick with that idea. So I guess other than just sharing my thoughts on the scripture tonight, I guess my thought or challenge for you is to think about in your own life, what has God promised you? What has he talked to you about? That in a lot of ways is just the fulfillment of his will in your life, or the fulfillment of a promise that he's made. And you're so afraid in some way of upsetting the status quo. You're so afraid of in a way it being right, or maybe you being wrong and having too much faith in it, that you bury Jesus in your life, that you bury the promise, that you kill the promise. And in some ways you try to hide the evidence so that nobody can ask you about it later. In what ways are we in our own lives, in our relationship with God, acting like the Pharisees, ignoring the fulfillment and the gifts and the promise that we had been waiting for all along, and being terrified of taking the big risk, the big leap, and being found out, and the level of excuses and things that we put in place to protect our ego or our pride. So, something to think about tonight. Have a great night, and we'll see you later.